Another chance to try and hit 10,000 steps before we get hit by a headache. Another chance to walk and talk and just meander through the weird, wonderful world that is my brain. And today we're talking about one, and I think we might have talked about this before, I don't remember, but it is an interesting topic, and that's homebrewing. Specifically, at what point does the homebrewing make it a different game? I mean, because when you think about it, every other tabletop role-playing game that's come out since day one, Dungeons and Dragons, is just some evolution of homebrew rules that somebody made based on game number one, right? Every game owes its birthing pains to grandfather Dungeons and Dragons. We could argue that Empire of the Pale Throne came first, or Bronstein came first, or there's now some that say Tunnels and Trolls predates Dungeons and Dragons. And there's some limited proof that might be true that's still being looked into. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, most of us, D&D was first. So therefore it would go to say that every other game that came out after is somebody looked at D&D and said, can I do X? I mean, that's basically the origins of the very first superhero role-playing game, Superhero 2024, was somebody said, I want to play the Flash. And that came from because on one of the original Wandering Monster tables, on one of them it said like 1d4 superheroes. Now superheroes was meaning a level of fighters, because back then, remember, each level had a name, and one of the names for a higher level fighter was hero, superhero, lord, so what it meant to say was you were running into some fourth level or higher fighters. But I guess somebody took it seriously and because I remember I took it seriously, and I was like, oh, what, you mean like run into like Batman and Spider-Man and shit? So yeah, the very first superhero role-playing game was homebrewing rules based upon a guy saying, I want to play the Flash. And that, 1d4 superheroes. So at what point does it stop being homebrews and start being a brand new game? What point is it I'm just reading a rule wrong? Ooh, sounds like there's a game. And become a homebrew? And at what point does the homebrew evolve so it's no longer the game you started playing, and it's become something completely new and different to the point where you can't call it anymore? Which I guess would kind of sort of connect to the never-ending nebulous argument of, well, what is Dungeons and Dragons? So let's use a classic, We'll do, again, for our example, we'll use the OGL, because we all know the OGL, and it's something we basically understand, right? So, first off, what's the difference between a homebrew and just, like I often do, misreading a rule, or a rule change that was in the errata, okay? Well, homebrew rule basically is you looked at something in the book and said, that doesn't work for me. I don't like it the way it reads. It doesn't fit my game. I want to change it. Early Arduin was basically a lot of homebrew rules. Let's make criticals and fumbles more deadly were some of the first homebrew rules. Adding rules for guns or giant robots or new types of magic would be homebrew rules. The game still remains relatively as you know it, but you've changed a few things. Adding a critical or fumble table would probably be something we all get. We all recognize that the critical fumble aim shot rules in core OGL aren't really there. So people have made multiple random tables and stuff to make criticals more deadly, fumbles more ridiculous, called shots, stuff like that. Those would be perfect examples of a homebrew rule. You haven't drastically changed anything. You've just sort of pumped it up a little, made it more deadly or less deadly, or added a new magic system. The game is still intrinsically the same game you bought, and anybody else who bought the game and comes would still understand 99%. And then you could just explain, oh yeah, in my game, if you roll a natural 20, you pull a card from this deck, or whatever. So that's a homebrew. Then there's a misinterpretation of a rule that becomes a homebrew. And that would be, a perfect example is the play test we did for D&D Next, which became 5th edition at CES Games and Anime around 2014, 2015. Recorded on the CES Games and Anime Facebook and my early vlog posts, where we misread advantage and disadvantage for the first month, and we were misdoing critical roles for almost a year before somebody pointed out to us that we were actually doing them wrong. So like for the first couple days, whether jokingly or sincerely, we totally misread advantage and disadvantage. Then we went again and realized we were doing it wrong. But for like the first year of 5e, we were doing crits wrong. And then somebody pointed out that we'd done them wrong, but we've been doing them for a year, so it was just like, you know what, we're just going to homebrew it and continue to do it the way we've all doing it. So there's a perfect example of something that was just misread, misunderstood, mispronounced, that became a homebrew. But we're still in the nugget of the game we know and love. You know, we're still in the nugget of the OGL. We're still using strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom, armor class, hit points, and level. This is things that we all accept as the tangible fact that is OGL, tabletop role-playing game, Dungeons and Dragons. We haven't done anything to drastically change it. It's still D&D. It's still D20. At what point do the amount of homebrews I've added make it a brand new game? And when it starts becoming a brand new game, when we have those spin-offs, you know, it usually starts with, can I do X with this system? And you look at the system and you go, no, I can't. I have to drastically change some aspect of the system to do X. Can I run the Flash in original Dungeons and Dragons, 1974, 1976, you know, Red Book, White Book, OG D&D? No, you can't. You can't do superheroes in the original D20 rule set. You have to drastically change it to reflect the reality of comic books. So at that point, they added so many homebrews that it became golden, completely different. Ooh, it's getting cold. Hi, how are you? Good to hear, my man. You can play a different game, you know, or take the next published game that came out in the early days, Traveler. That uses D6s. You know, there's only a few recognizable things that a D&D player who'd never seen anything but original D&D comes to Traveler and looks at it and goes, well, I recognize strength and intelligence, but I'm rolling D6s and I can die in character creation and there's this whole life path and it's completely different. Well, Traveler had to come from somewhere, and because, you know, nothing exists in a void, it probably started with them looking at D20, 1974, 1976 D20, and going, yeah, I can't do space with the rules as they're written. I can't do the hardcore space game I want to run. I need to change things. D20 doesn't work for me. It doesn't really work with the way I want the genre of the game to play out. Let's try D8s. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try D6s. Wow, D6s work. Let's just make everything D6s. D6s are easy to find. Everybody knows what those are. You don't have to worry about wackadoodle shaped dice. Drastically changed. Presented a completely different system. Took homebrews of running a space game and just kept refining them and refining them and refining them. Oop, gotta tie the shoes. Till they became something new. It became a completely different game. At that point, that would be when the amount of homebrews have so drastically changed the original engine that it's a completely new game. Which brings us to the whole ship of Theseus, what is D&D argument that Harmony Ginger brought up and I briefly discussed the other day, because as we know, everything is Harmony Ginger's fault. So in this, we're applying the ship of Theseus argument, or the broom argument to make it simpler, to the idea of Dungeons and Dragons versus the Dungeons and Dragons rule stuff. So if you're not familiar with the ship of Theseus / broom rule, or philosophical argument, is basically you take the ship of Theseus, which is on display in a museum, and as years pass, you have to repair and replace parts of the boat. So you replace one part with a brand new part. You replace another part with a brand new part. You replace another part with a brand new part. After some point in time, you've replaced every single solitary part. Hi, friend. Hi, friend. Good afternoon. Of the boat or the broom with completely new parts. Is it still the ship of Theseus, or is it a brand new boat? Is it a brand new broom? Is it still Dungeons and Dragons, or is it a brand new game? Because Wizards of the Coast has taken D&D as we know it, replaced it with all sorts of brand new parts, and then released it again under the same name. But is it still Dungeons and Dragons, or is it a brand new game? They say no. It's not a brand new game. It's still D&D. It's backwards compatible, even though we know that's not true. Oh, look at the pupples. We could argue that because Hasbro owns the name Dungeons and Dragons, they can call whatever they want Dungeons and Dragons, and it is Dungeons and Dragons. They could call this tree Dungeons and Dragons. That tree is now D&D, because we can call anything we want Dungeons and Dragons. That's our name, our brand. And we can put our name, our brand on anything, and therefore it becomes Dungeons and Dragons, i.e. Dungeons and Dragons meat snacks. Because there was a brilliant idea. And Magic the Gathering Hot Pockets. You always wondered where the band cards went, huh? So in name, yes. The current iteration, are those the bird watchers, I think? I think they're bird watchers. Afternoon. In name, yes, it's still D&D. 2024, 2025, Wizards of the Coast D20 is still Dungeons and Dragons. Howdy. Hi, dog. In name. Is it still Dungeons and Dragons in the same way that it uses the same mechanics as the original game? Yes, it still uses the Common Core, OGL, Strength, Dex, Con, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma, Armor Class, Hit Points, Level, Class-based D20. That's still there. It still has the same core 4, Fighter, Cleric, Magic User, Thief. Those are still in the game. They've been around since, year 0 in one form or another. Still has orcs. No, actually, it doesn't have orcs anymore. But still has the same basic idea that it's always had, of fantasy, of Saturday morning cartoon, fantasy, Hollywood, medieval, level-based role-playing game. Is it still Gygaxian Dungeons and Dragons? No. It has evolved into a brand new thing. Is it still 1980s Advanced Dungeons and Dragons into 3.5 D&D? No, it's not. It's evolved into a brand new thing. But is it still D&D, or is it a brand new game? Well, it's a brand new edition of the game. And that edition is not very similar to the original edition, but there's enough things that are the same that you could, good morning, argue, yeah, it's still D&D. It's still got strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, fighter, magic user, rogue, thief, level 1 through 20. Thaco's gone. Whatever. That's the first homebrew rule that they changed, fundamentally changed D&D. The percentile rolls are gone. That's another homebrew rule that fundamentally changed Dungeons and Dragons when they got rid of the percentiles. Races class is gone. That's another fundamental change to D&D. They added more classes. It's definitely not Gygaxian 1970s D&D. Good afternoon. It's definitely not Thaco 1E D&D, but it's still, whether you like it or not, Dungeons and Dragons. They have not drastically changed the rules enough that I could say, no, it's a completely new game. It's a new edition. Gygaxian level-based D20 is not what 2024 Wizards of the Coast D20 is. It's their own thing, which is fine. If you still want to play Gygaxian-based, level-based D20 fantasy role-playing Dungeons and Dragons, there are several thousand retro clones out there that would allow you to continue to emulate classic 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s D20 roleplay. They are different enough that they cannot be sued by Wizards of the Coast while still following the parameters of the current OGL ORC license. They have different names. They have enough homebrews in them that they do not violate Wizards of the Coast copyright. But are they fundamentally a completely different game? Dungeon Crawl Classics has a lot of wackadoodle rules in it. A lot of wackadoodle percentile-based nonsense in it that's absolutely wonderful. But at its core, it's still OGL D20. Shadowdark has a lot of weird new rules in it, changes a lot of things up, but at its core, it's still OGL D20. Does that make it a different game? Or just a paramutation of an existing game? How many homebrews before Shadowdark can say, I'm a completely different game with no connection to D20 whatsoever? Well, you'd have to completely get rid of, or alter the base OGL mechanics that it could be recognized as something new. Perhaps you do what Daggerheart's doing. You know, fundamentally it's still a fantasy role-playing game, but it is so drastically different that nobody can say, oh, Daggerheart's a D&D retro clone. No, the rules are completely different. Everything about it's completely different. It's based upon D6s. The classes have different names. The magic system's completely different. It is not a retro clone. It is its own thing in the fantasy game market. So for Shadowdark, our favorite OGL retro clone of the moment, to become a completely different thing, the first thing Kelsey would probably have to do is change the dice. All right, I currently use D4s, D6, D8s, D10s, D12s, D20. Let's change that. Let's use, I don't know, D8 dice pools, or some variation of something that's completely different. Once that's drastically changes, it starts to become a new game. Let's change the names of the stats. I don't want to use the OGL names anymore. I want my game to be completely different. Let's change strength to brawn and dex to speed and constitution to health, intelligence to knowledge, wisdom to faith, and charisma to willpower. And then we'll add a looks stat, because too many people confuse charisma with looks, and they're not the same. So let's add a just physical beauty stat. All right, now we've drastically changed the stats. We've drastically changed how those stats are generated. Ooh, covered a bee. Big bumblebee. Hi, buddy. What are you doing? Go, 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 pollinate, pollinate. Big chubby bumblebee. Now we've drastically changed it. It's not OGL anymore. It's not D20 anymore. It is not a Gygaxian level-based retro clone. We have now homebrewed it enough that we could represent it as a brand new game. Shadowdark 2nd edition, using the Shadowdark proprietary tabletop role-playing game D8 based system. So there you go. Hopefully, in my 21 minutes of meandering and random thought explosions, I have somehow explained what a homebrew is, when the number of homebrews exceed the maximum capacity and make it a brand new game. And, you know, is a retro clone a brand new game? Or is it just revisiting something we already know and we're comfortable with? And we're, you know, the broom argument is probably the best argument. You know, if I take a broom and I remove the stick and replace it with a new stick, and then I take the bristles and I remove the bristles and I replace them with new bristles, is it still the same broom? No, it's a completely new broom, but it still does the same job. I've changed the ship of Theseus. It's no longer the ship of Theseus. It's a completely different boat, but it still looks like the ship of Theseus and it still does the same job. So there you go. Homebrew evolving to brand new game, evolving to just putting a new slap of paint on an existing game, or, you know, reading something the wrong way and then deciding, oh, well, we're going to do it this anyway because that's the way we've been doing it because we read it the wrong way. All different ways to approach the same problem. Hopefully somewhere. Howdy. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Hopefully somewhere in there I actually explained what I think the difference is. And of course, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I suppose it depends upon how you define homebrews, and in your own brain, what's the difference between just homebrewing and a completely different system? And I again would say, well, as long as you haven't drastically changed anything, it's not a new system, it's just a new edition of an existing system, i.e. 2024 D&D is still Wizards of the Coast D20, but Free League's Year Zero D6 dice pool system is a completely different game, even though they have 2-3 fantasy games that you could be say, oh, it's D&D-esque in that it's fantasy, but it's not D&D because it uses a completely different rule system. So there you go. Hopefully that helps. I'll talk to y'all later. Have a great weekend. Stay safe out there.